All right, good morning. This will be the last Sunday of this quarter. It's gone by quickly. I apologize. I think I have my PowerPoint fixed from last week. I grabbed an old PowerPoint and made some changes to it. And sometimes when I do that, I may grab one I like the template, or like this one, I knew I just wasn't going to be able to change a whole lot. And sometimes I forget that we've changed our formatting. We don't use the square 4:3 anymore. Sorry, Brian, by the way. I think Brian was working the AV booth last week, and I apologize for that because it kind of makes everything go squirrely when you use the old format with our setup now. But anyways, I think I've got that straightened out. I had used this one because, like I said, it's got most of the material I wanted. I had to make a few changes, but it's got most of the material I wanted to cover. And then for the sermon last Sunday as well, I used an old template, and same thing. I just forgot it was in the square format. But anyway, we are trying to do a very, very brief overview of intertestamental period. So we're going to pick up. I'll bring you up to speed real quick where we covered last week. We're talking about, again, it's a Reader's Digest version, but the 400 years of silence from Malachi, the close of Malachi, to the opening of the book of Matthew. We pointed out in our Old Testament history class that this is really, chronologically, it would be around the end of Nehemiah's work to the opening of the New Testament, but you get the idea. The contrast in the Jews' conditions, we talked about this. I'm not going to rehash all that. I just wanted to bring it up to remind you that at the close of the Old Testament, things were very different from how they are when you open up and begin reading in the book of Matthew and reading the gospel accounts about the life of Christ, the birth of Christ, and the work of Christ. It's just very different. And you see that under all those bullets. Again, I know I'm going to move through that quickly. If you need the slide, if you want something, maybe you didn't catch that last week or whatever, but I'm happy to share anything that I've got. So, but I don't want to just redo the material. But I did want to bring that up just to remind us things were very different with their condition, not just the Jews' conditions in a general sense, but in the religious sense. Things were very different with their religion. There were some assumptions about immortality that you see. This clash come to light between Pharisees and Sadducees at the opening of the New Testament. Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in angels or spirits. Pharisees do. Synagogue worship. You don't read about that in the Old Testament. But when you open up in the New Testament, it's just assumed. It's, synagogues are everywhere. You have this inferior temple. To close the Old Testament, they've rebuilt the temple, restored it, rebuilt it. I guess it's kind of a combination of those. But when you open up the New Testament, you have this magnificent temple that was built by Herod the Great and really was still under construction at the opening of the New Testament. There's no feast of dedication in the Old Testament. You read about that. Jesus even attending it, John 10:22. That comes about as a result of the Maccabean revolt. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Intermarriage was a big problem at the close of the Old Testament. Not so much when you open up in the New Testament. A lot of changes, a lot of differences, and that's one of the reasons why this study is important. As I said, I know it's brief what we're doing in these 2 weeks, but we'll at some point we'll do a more in-depth study of that over a quarter or so. It all centers around Galatians 4:4. When the fullness of time was come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law. Next verse says, to redeem them that were under the law, that we, talking about Christians, that we might receive the adoption of sons. We are God's children. Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Well, that's because of Jesus. And we said it over and over again in the Old Testament overview. It's all looking toward the Messiah. And God was silent in the terms of the pen of Revelation during those 400 or so years, but He wasn't inactive. He was not indifferent. There was a lot going on to help bring about the fullness of time, and we've sort of paraphrased Galatians 4:4 previously, and I think it's certainly is an accurate paraphrase of what Paul is getting at there by inspiration. This fullness of time when everything was just right. My dad used to say all the time, so. You get everything so. It was kind of I don't know if that's just a southern expression or what, but that's an expression I heard a lot growing up to mean it's just right. So that's what this all centers around, is God getting everything ready to send his son into the world. It begins you get a glimpse of this with the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, that great image, the stone cut out without hands that comes and smites the image, and the image breaks into pieces and is consumed, but this stone grows into a kingdom. It's an everlasting kingdom that'll never be destroyed, Daniel 2:44. So that dream, it offered a chance. It was God's providence, and really even working miraculously there through Daniel, to promote Daniel. Daniel's going to be in the king's palace in Babylon, Jeremiah in the homeland, Ezekiel among the captives, making sure that God's people, even in captivity, even in their punishment, they're receiving instruction and revelation from God. But it's also a preview of coming history. That's what you see in that dream. Those 4 world empires, Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, Greece, and Rome. But it's also a projection of how God is going to set up his everlasting kingdom. And that's the end game. So don't forget that. We discussed that image a little bit more in detail looking at this image. Again, I'm moving quickly through these because we covered them last week. So if you want to get an image or just get the whole PowerPoint or whatever, just let me know. I'll be glad to share that with you. The 4 beasts in Daniel 7, we discussed this. And you've got these beasts that are meant to represent kingdoms. Same 4 world empires: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Babylon being like a lion with wings, that swift rise to power. Medo-Persians like a bear, the 3 ribs in his mouth. Babylon, Lydia, Persia, Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt, the conquest there that the Persians made. Of course, remember Cyrus, he will conquer Babylon, he will conquer Lydia, but his son Cambyses will finish the conquest of Egypt. And then the leopard. Leopards are, swift cat, but also not only that, it's got 4 wings. Very swift rise to power. We'll talk about that when we get to talking about the Grecian Empire. And it's got 4 heads because Alexander's not going to leave an heir, and his kingdom's going to be divided basically among 4 generals. It's not that somebody sat down and said, okay, here, you take this, you take this, you take that. That's not why it was divided. He didn't leave an heir, and so they fight, of course. And it'll end up, settling out into 4 different areas. And then this diverse beast, exceedingly dreadful, terrible, representing the Roman Empire. Of course, Rome was certainly a force to be reckoned with. I mean, they were a world power. Babylon, we talked about this. Again, I've got this brought up all in just one slide without the animations because we did discuss Babylon, the background of the Samaritans. That's, of course, under the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, took them into captivity. They resettled that area with people who were foreign. They began to intermingle, and so you have this race of the Samaritans. They're, sort of, at least in the beginning, they're half Jewish, half Gentile. And so you have that's where some of the beginnings of the animosity between Jews and Samaritans. When the Jews go to rebuild the temple, some of these Samaritans are going to come along and say, hey, we're going to help you out. They want to worship their other gods, but hey, your God's one of the gods, so we'll help you with this. And the Jews said, no, that you don't have any part in this. And that upset the Samaritans, as you can imagine. And so you get some of that clash. There's more to it than that, of course, but that's kind of a very condensed version of some of that animosity. The Jews didn't have a temple in Babylon, so that's where synagogue worship begins popping up. Eventually it kind of settles out. They kind of establish sort of a rule that you need 10 heads of Jewish families, 10 heads of a house, or 10 heads of households to establish a synagogue. I've read before that it was more in places where they had a higher population, but generally speaking it was like 10 heads of households to establish a synagogue. That's why sometimes you'll read about, there's not a synagogue in some places, just not enough Jewish families there to establish it, and so they would go to another city and join in with a synagogue there. But in the first century, these synagogues, they make a ready-made audience for the Jews, and again, I think I mentioned this kind of closing out last week, anybody could speak up. Any Jewish man could speak up in the synagogue. And sometimes they would say, there's kind of pros and cons to that, I suppose, because you just open the floor to anybody, and sometimes you don't know what you're going to get, right? And no doubt the rabbi who was in charge or whatever, he would kind of have the last say, but they would just open up the floor. Does anybody have anything they want to? A word of exhortation is kind of the way they put it in Acts chapter 13, and of course a man named Paul is there, and he says, right here, I got a word of exhortation. They say on, and so he begins to talk to them about Jewish history, and they're all on board with that. Of course, then he begins to talk about the Christ, and he meets some opposition because the Jews they were not accepting, at least for the most part, of the Messiah. Some of them did, but some of them they literally wanted to kill Paul. So that's the Babylonian Empire. Now let's talk about Persia, and I'll try to keep an eye on time because I want to make sure we get through this material, even if we have to get really, really overview, because I do want to cover all the high points of this intertestamental period. Persia. We talked about Cyrus in the first class. Like I said, I got so much there. I realized I couldn't cover it at that pace, and so I had to kind of drop back and punt, as we say, and alter my approach to this overview. But Cyrus, he was the king of Persia that would allow God's people to go home. This was spoken of in Ezra 1 through 4. It was prophesied in Isaiah 44:28, Isaiah 45:1, Isaiah 45:13. He was called by name over 100 years before he was even born. That doesn't happen without divine revelation. That's not just a lucky guess, folks. That's divine revelation from heaven. Some people from all tribes returned. I mentioned this in more detail in other places, so I won't go into great detail. But there are sacrifices mentioned in Ezra 6:17, one for each tribe. And do you remember how many there were? There were 12 sacrifices there. That was one for each tribe. There are no lost tribes. That concept is a part of the false teaching of premillennialism. This idea that Jesus is going to come back and establish kind of an earthly kingdom with an earthly throne. That's not going to happen. The kingdom that Jesus rules over is a spiritual kingdom. He said it himself talking to Pilate. My kingdom is not of this world, John 18:36. And so he didn't come to set up an earthly kingdom. They tried to take him by force in John 6 and make him a king, and he doesn't say, hey, great, this is what I came for. He goes off into a deserted place to pray. That's not why he came. He is reigning over God's kingdom currently. He went back into heaven. Of course, Daniel 7:13 and 14. Saw in the night visions, one like the Son of Man. They brought him near before the Ancient of Days. And one of the things they gave him was a kingdom and dominion. So Jesus now reigns over the kingdom of God, and that is not a physical entity. It is a spiritual entity. It is the church. And at the end of time, he's not going to begin his reign. He's going to end his reign. He's going to turn the kingdom, deliver it up to the Father. We're told that in 1 Corinthians 15. What is it, about verses 24 through 26 or so? So his people from all tribes return. But after the exile, the majority of Jews were never living in Palestine. So you see sometimes they'll talk about the dispersion. Diaspora is the Greek term that's used. In fact, James will use this. He uses kind of a play on words in James 1:1. He's writing to those of the dispersion. He's not writing to Jews, fleshly Jews. He's writing to spiritual Jews that are dispersed all over. And so it's a reference there, kind of, like I said, a little bit of a play on words. It's the dispersion, but not talking about physical lineage, but spiritual lineage. Persia, they bring strict law and order to the world. In fact, we talked about this in Sunday morning sermon last week about getting it in writing and how the law of the Medes and the Persians, it alters not. Even the king couldn't change it. The king signs that decree. You can't pray to anybody for 30 days except to the king. Daniel continues to pray. They come and tattle on him. And the king he's upset with himself because he realizes he's been played. They've tricked him into making this law, and they did it just to get Daniel, because they knew that was the only thing they could find against him, was to find something against him concerning his spirituality and his religious conviction. So the king tries to get Daniel released, and they say, no, king. Remember, it's the law of the Medes and the Persians that altereth not. And so Daniel went into the lion's den, but of course God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths, and they didn't hurt him. And Daniel came out unscathed. But this strong sense of law and order is going to carry on into the Grecian Empire and also into the Roman Empire. You see a trickle-down effect from each of these world empires that goes into the days when Jesus is born into the world, this fullness of time. And it has an effect to help facilitate the mission of Jesus and also especially the mission of evangelism, teaching and preaching the gospel to the world. This strong sense of law and order will contribute to peace and to the protection that you see when the apostles and various other Christians are going to go out into the world, and as they that were scattered abroad, Acts 8:4, went everywhere teaching the word, teaching and preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. You see this in numerous places. Just a couple of examples here. Acts 22:24 through 26. You've got Paul, and the Jews are basically fighting over Paul. He's the Jews, and they want to get after him, and so he makes a statement. He realizes there are Pharisees and Sadducees there, and remember the Sadducees, they don't believe in the resurrection, and so Paul says, it's kind of a clever thing that he does there. I don't know if he's just trying to buy himself some time or what, but he says, I'm called into question this day because of the resurrection. Well, the Pharisees say, oh, well, let him speak then. And the Sadducees say, oh, no, because they don't believe in the resurrection. And so they begin to they start to fight amongst each other over Paul, and they're about to tear him in two. And the Romans come along. The Romans aren't going to have any ruckus going on among the subjects, the people that are subject to Rome. And they can't figure out what's going on, so they decide, well, it's all about this guy Paul, so let's just take him inside, get him inside, and we'll just scourge him. We'll beat the fool out of him, is what my mom used to say. You knew you were in trouble when she said, I'm about to beat the fool out of you. And that was a figure of way. I don't want anybody to think I've just got abused. My mom gets on to me sometimes if she ever hears my classes or sermons, and she'll say, people think I'm probably some kind of tyrant or something. I say, well, I think people probably understand I deserved it. But it was a figure of speech. But I got some pretty good ones. But they say, we're going to beat the fool out of him. And when we lay enough stripes on him, he'll tell us the truth. They're going to, it's kind of I guess an ancient form of torture and interrogation. They didn't waterboard him, they just scourge him. So anyway, they decide that's what they're going to do with Paul, and we'll figure it out. He'll eventually tell us the truth. And so they're about to commence beating on him, and Paul says, hey, is this legal for you to beat a man who's a Roman citizen and uncondemned? Oh, you're a citizen? Yeah, I am. And so now they kind of go, whoa, hold on. Because you see, there were laws in place that, even though they were Romans, they were soldiers, the Romans were in control, but there were still laws, and Paul was a Roman citizen. And so he goes to the centurion, this other fellow, and he says, hey, take heed what you do. This man's a citizen. So now they're treading lightly. And of course, in Romans 25:11, you have Paul appealing to Caesar. And what do they say? You don't get an appeal. You just old Jewish fella. You're under Roman rule, buddy. No. They say, well, he's a Roman citizen. You appeal to Caesar you shall go. So Persia, law and order. A lot of strict law and order that they brought into the world that trickles down into these other kingdoms. Greece. The conquest of Greece over Persia is prophesied in Daniel chapter 8. I wish we had more time to go there. A lot of great detail in that chapter. It's amazing prophecy there in Daniel chapter 8 of the rise of Alexander the Great in Greece to power. Alexander the Great himself is a pretty amazing study. He became king at age 20. I can't even imagine if somebody had entrusted me with a kingdom at age 20. That would have been a disaster for the entire world. But he was something else. His dad was Philip of Macedon, of course, you recall from world history. But he was king at age 20. He defeated Persia at the age of 26. And that kind of established him as a world conqueror. He conquered the entire East. And then he died at age 33. Just really pretty amazing when you just stop and think about it. I have never been able to establish this. I haven't done really a deep dive into the history of ancient Greece and Alexander the Great, but I did have a teacher in high school that he was one of those teachers that he just made you want to study. He made history fun. He made it interesting, and he made me love history. I just really, really enjoyed history and studying under him because he would dive so deep into some of these subjects, and he had some of these interesting little tidbits that were just amazing. But one of those was, let me change batteries. One of those things was that Alexander the Great, he said in his research, he had discovered that Alexander the Great had a drinking problem. And you do find some instances. In fact, I didn't bring the book with me. Charles Pfeiffer's book, Between the Testaments, he mentions that when Alexander gets to, is one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire had several kind of capitals, but when he gets to one of them, and if somebody knows it, you can tell me, but he just sacks it. I mean, very uncharacteristic for Alexander. He had a great appreciation for history. Y'all give me just 1 second here. Guess I better turn it off first. There we go. He had a great appreciation for history, and he loved historical monuments and things like that, but he gets to this one capital and he just sacks it. And I mean, it was just, Pfeiffer comments in his book, it's very uncharacteristic. People don't exactly understand why Alexander did that. It doesn't make sense. Historians debate why he did it. If it's true that he did have a drinking problem, then that might very well explain it. But Mr. Zen was my high school teacher's name. And Bill Zen, I remember it was just, like I said, one of those teachers that you don't ever forget him. He just, so much I learned under him. But he said, that would happen sometimes, Alexander. He'd get to drinking, and in his drunken stupor, he'd just, some monument of history, and he'd say, burn it, level it. And they would. And then he'd sober up and said sometimes literally he'd cry because he realized he'd destroyed something that was a major, major part of history. But anyway, Alexander was educated by Aristotle. So you can imagine the education that he got as a young man. He was educated by this great philosopher, Aristotle. Charles Pfeiffer in his book calls Alexander the apostle of Hellenism. Certainly he was. He had this idea of Hellenism, and he wanted to spread it throughout the entire world. And so he would establish cities and call them, one of the most famous was Alexandria, named after himself, of course. But he wanted to establish these model Hellenistic communities in all the lands that he conquered. And one of the most successful, best known successful examples is Alexandria in Egypt. And in fact, we have cities all over even our country known as Alexandria, named after that first Alexandria. I won't mention much about this. I had this. I got to move on. But Alexander, when he came to Jerusalem, there's a story, and most of it seems to be legend, anyways. But he did show favor to the Jews. He came there, wasn't real happy with the Jews, but he, supposedly he had this dream, and he dreamed about a man coming out to him in priestly garb, and supposedly the high priest, comes out to meet Alexander as he's coming to Jerusalem. He's in full priestly garb, and Alexander's like, this is the dream. And so he suddenly changes his mind and it becomes favorable to the Jews. Again, most of that's legend, no doubt, but it is kind of an interesting thing. But many in the world welcomed Alexander as a deliverer. Most, I don't know it might be fair to say most. At least a lot of the people he conquered didn't view him as a conqueror. They viewed him more as a deliverer. A lot of these places, the government was becoming corrupt. You got a king who's just kind of doing his own thing. He's not, most of these kings, they weren't subject to the laws. They just did things on a whim. And a lot of times they were very selfish. And so a lot of times people weren't very happy and conditions weren't great. And so here comes Alexander, and they're saying, come on, well, we're happy to see a change. As far as Alexandria, many of the Jews flocked there. From that point forward, there's going to be a huge concentration of Jews in Alexandria, there in Egypt. And it sometimes was known as Greater Palestine because of the concentration of Jews who lived there. But Alexander set up that city, and he invited many of the Jews to come there, and many of them did. And so you're going to see a strong Jewish presence there. In fact, you'll see it influence even interpretation of scriptures later on, even on after Jesus has ascended into heaven and after what we would call the period of New Testament writing. Once the canon of Scripture is closed, no later than about AD 96, you're going to see some Alexandrian ideas clash with others. The Alexandrians had a very allegorical way of interpreting Scripture. And a lot of times even Old Testament accounts, they would just interpret it, well, it's just a story, and what's the meaning behind this story? But Alexandria really comes into play a lot, even in that regard. Greece. Alexander, he died with no heir. I mentioned this earlier. He doesn't have a child. He did have a child. I can't remember if I mentioned this last week or not. Alexander had a wife. Roxana was her name. And she was pregnant when he died. Oh, I do have that on my slide here. And the son was born after he died, but the son was murdered along with his mother by Cassander. And Cassander is one of those 4 officials or generals among whom Alexander's kingdom ended up being divided. So Alexander dies, there's no heir. They begin to fight. These 4 men, Lysimachus, he ends up kind of ruling over Thrace. Cassander will end up with Macedonia and Greece. Cassander's the one that goes after Roxana and her child. And then Ptolemy, of course, Egypt, we recognize that name, Ptolemy's, right? And then Seleucus, he ends up ruling over the area of Syria. These kingdoms, they're going to war against one another. By the way, Seleucus, I was trying to remember, Antigonus. Seleucus, this is kind of how it settles out. The 4 generals, let me back up just a little bit. The 4 generals or officials were Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Antigonus. Seleucus was one of Antigonus' generals. And he's going to end up, I'd have to review my history to see, but I think he ends up killing or at least defeating Antigonus. But anyways, he emerges as the 4th one. Even though he was not technically one of Alexander's generals, he was Antigonus' general. But anyways, those are your 4 guys that end up with the power. And they're going to fight amongst each other constantly. And of course, guess who's stuck in the middle often? Palestine, the Jews. Daniel 11, man, the remarkable prophecies there in Daniel 11 detail this struggle of the Seleucian Syria with Ptolemaic Egypt. And the Ptolemies ruling there. They're constantly at each other. And I got an image I'll show you in just a minute where you kind of see how the Jews, poor Jews, are just caught in the middle. And every time somebody gets defeated and they go home angry and upset, and you have a bad day at work and you go home and kick the cat, well, that's kind of what they did. The Jews in Palestine was the cat. And they go back home mad, upset because they got defeated, and a lot of times they took it out on the Jews. So from 336 until Rome, 336 BC, of course, until Rome overthrows Carthage in around 146 BC, Greek culture dominates world affairs. But again, even after Rome takes over, there's a lot of Hellenistic influence even in the Roman Empire. And that's going to become the new, the captivity broke the Jews from idolatry. But the new challenge for them is, and I guess in a sense it is still in one way idolatry, but the new challenge is Hellenism and just wanting to blend in with the world around them. And you see a group, the pious ones, the Hebrew term is Hasidim. They're the ones that want to stay true to the book and they want to stay distinct from the world. But then you got the Hellenistic Jews, and they just want to blend in. And sometimes even to the point of participating in the Greek gymnasiums, and they want to go there and participate and exercise in the nude and all that goes along with that. It just becomes a real big struggle. But here's this picture I mentioned, and you can see the king of the north. This picture is meant to detail, or at least give it kind of an illustration of Daniel 11, the prophecies. The king of the north, that's the Syrian king, and the king of the south is the Ptolemy, or the Egyptians. And if you want to march north to attack Syria from Egypt, you're going to go through Jerusalem, Palestine. If you want to go south, if you're the king of Syria, to attack Egypt, you're going through Palestine. So constantly caught in the middle. This Hellenistic period, the Ptolemies, they'll control Palestine for about 100 a little over 100 years. Ptolemies were gracious. They were cultured people. The Seleucids were more warlike, rough type people. There's little interference from the Ptolemies when they're in control as far as with the Jews, as long as the Jews paid their tribute. But that's going to change, of course, under the Seleucids. Alexander, he's going to make the Greek language a nearly universal language. It's a very flexible language. You know, the expression, the Greeks have a word for it. And, of course, that's going to become, this Koine or Common Greek is going to become the language of the New Testament. It will end up being the language of the New Testament. The LXX, or the Septuagint, was published or was finished. Well, I don't know about finished, but it was done in 250 BC. This was originally references the Pentateuch only. Later on, around the 3rd century AD, they'll have the entire Old Testament Scripture in Greek. This is going to familiarize non-Jews with the Scriptures. These non-Jews who are fluent in Greek, and maybe they sometimes even, you know, as generations go, they're barely even functional sometimes in Hebrew. So they don't understand the original language. So this gets them able to be familiar with the Scriptures. They can read it and understand these messianic prophecies, which is, of course, helping lead up to the fullness of time. It formed the basis, the Septuagint did, of first century preaching. New Testament quotes, you'll see, if you have, you don't even have to be a scholar with Greek or anything like that, but you can, or with Hebrew, but you can do some research and see that sometimes when Paul, even Jesus, in fact in Luke 4, when Jesus reads in the synagogue, the reading doesn't match the Hebrew. He's reading from a version of the Septuagint. He's reading a prophecy there, and sometimes they'll quote from the original Hebrew, and then sometimes it's just a paraphrase. We do that even today. The Ptolemies are going to give way to the Seleucids, and that's going to set the stage for this long-time clash between Jews and that Hellenistic influence. The Seleucids, we got to talk about them. Nicator, he was the first king of the north. He's not the first Seleucian king, but he was the first king of the north that's referenced in Daniel chapter 11. His son was Antiochus III, or he's often referred to as Antiochus the Great. And he eventually will prevail over Egypt. He's going to establish another city like Alexander after his own name, and it's Antioch, which is also going to become very important when you get into New Testament times. But when Antiochus the Great invaded Greece, Rome declared war on him. They didn't like that. And so they defeated him, and they gave some conditions for his surrender. He had to surrender a number of possessions of his, had to cede a lot of land to the Romans. He had to defray the war's expenses. He couldn't keep any elephants. They used those, of course, in their war. Philip was kind of famous for that, Philip of Macedon, Alexander's dad. And he could keep no more than 12 ships in his navy. He also had to send hostages to Rome, 12 hostages to Rome, and one of them was his son, Antiochus IV. So Antiochus IV is going to go and he's going to learn about Roman ways, and he's going to, if nothing else, he's going to develop a respect for the power of Rome. They're not there yet as far as world power, ready for world conquest, but they were very strong. Antiochus IV later on is going to be king of Syria. He comes back. He was not killed in that captivity. He ends up being allowed to come home, and he's going to become king of Syria, Antiochus IV. But he also is known as self-proclaimed Antiochus Epiphanes, which means the illustrious. And it seems he was declaring himself some kind of a god. Here's the thing with Antiochus Epiphanes, though. He was determined to Hellenize his entire empire. The others, I just went blank. The Ptolemies, couldn't think of that name for some reason. The Ptolemies, remember, as long as Jews paid their tribute, they left them alone pretty much. Not Antiochus Epiphanes. He says you are going to become Hellenistic, and you can forget about your Jewish religion. He would have completely subdued Egypt were it not for Rome. Rome's getting stronger and stronger. Still not quite there, but they're a force to be reckoned with for sure at this time. Rome wasn't quite ready to annex Syria and Egypt. They weren't powerful enough for that yet, but they weren't willing to let Antiochus Epiphanes strengthen himself with a conquest of Egypt. That would have made them a little bit more difficult for Rome to conquer. So they weren't going to quite allow that to happen. And so, this famous scene from history, we've talked about it before, where here's Antiochus Epiphanes. He's marching toward Egypt, and he's going to conquer, and probably would have conquered, the Romans meet him and say, cease and desist. And Antiochus Epiphanes says what? I tell you what, let me think about it. And you remember what the Roman general says to him? He gets his sword and he draws a circle around Antiochus Epiphanes in the sand. He says, think all you want, but when you step outside this circle, you better have an answer. And of course, no means war. Yes means you're turning around and going home. Well, he was sent packing, and you can imagine how he felt about that. I mean, he's Antiochus the Illustrious, right? So how do you think he's going to go home? Pretty upset. And that begins kind of the dark ages. I don't know if I'd say dark ages, but a dark period. I was trying to remember the term that Pfeiffer uses in his book. Anyways, some of it's referred to as the abomination of desolation, but that's got a more specific reference. But it's kind of a dark period in the Jews' history. His dreams of grandeur are gone. So Antiochus, he goes back home in bitterness. And if Egypt is going to remain a rival, and they were allowed to remain a rival because he couldn't go and conquer them, the Romans stopped him. But if that's going to be the case, he decides it is more crucial than ever that I control Palestine and have them under my thumb, as we use that expression. So Antiochus, he enforced Hellenism on the Jews. His edict demanded this fusion of all the Seleucid Empire into one people. He kills a number of Jews, pillages and plunders the city in a Sabbath attack. He attacked them on the Sabbath because he knew they're not going to defend themselves on the Sabbath. Later on, the Jews are going to decide, you know what, it's okay to defend yourself on the Sabbath. That takes some time because a lot of people took advantage of the Sabbath law to attack the Jews. He plundered the temple. He built an idolatrous altar, sacrificed a sow on the altar. That was an abomination to the Jews. Compelled them to cease their observance of Judaism, called circumcision, punishable by death. He looked for books of Scripture to destroy them, burn them. Antiochus boasted that the religion of Jehovah had ceased. It had not, of course, and that is why we say enter the Maccabees, because these Maccabees, Antiochus emissaries, they erected a pagan altar at Modin. And you have Mattathias. He's asked to come and kind of set an example and offer. You have a young, timid Jew. After Mattathias refuses, he comes and he's afraid of Antiochus. Mattathias proceeds to kill the apostate Jew and the emissary of Antiochus. And so that begins the Maccabean revolt. He was called, later on they're going to be called Judas is going to come into play. He's the Maccabee, Mattathias' son, and that means the hammer. Judas the hammer, they knew him as. That's that word, Maccabee. So the Feast of Dedication commemorates this occasion. And so that struggle lasts about 33 years. Later on, John Hyrcanus is going to come along and conquer the Idumeans or the Edomites. It comes from that people. And so you have this growing conflict between compromise and tradition. Man, I got so much more I want to cover. The Pharisees, these were the conservatives of the day. Their domain was the synagogue. You got the Sadducees. Their domain was the temple. And they were the kind of the liberals of the day. And then I do want to mention the Zealots. They did not accept Rome at all. They were constantly rebelling against Rome, and that's going to their gathering of following is going to lead to Rome coming against Jerusalem in AD 70 to destroy it. The Zealots would not pay taxes. They would not acknowledge Caesar. They were something else. Of course, Simon the apostle was a zealot. Matthew was a publican. And if ever two people you could never imagine working together, it's a zealot and a publican. Jesus, though, brought them together. That's the power of the gospel. So the Zealots end up leading to the destruction of Jerusalem. Essenes, these were very ascetic people. Not mentioned in the New Testament. I just mentioned them because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls thanks to the Essenes. And so they actually have contributed to helping us to understand Scripture. Finally, let me bring these 4 images up here for you, and then I'll close with that. I'll leave that up for a little bit before they want to run the slideshow. I do want to say this before I close out. I have here several copies. I appreciate Sister Becky Hester. She sent this to me. It's from the front part or so of her Bible. She's got a Thomas Nelson King James Study Bible. It's copyright 1994, but there's an intertestamental period chronology. Several key dates here. I've got this. It's in full-page form. We can, if you want to get a smaller version, we can get a small version that you can stick inside your Bible if that helps. But it is very, very useful to remember these key dates and how everything kind of happens leading right up to the fullness of time when God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we today, until the end of time, might receive the adoption of sons of God. It's a Reader's Digest version of intertestamental period history. I really am looking forward to getting a deeper study of this, and we'll do that sometime in the not too distant future. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before our worship. And I have these